After Oxfordshire County Council approved plans to lock residents into one of 6 zones to save the planet from global warming, protests against the decision are being organised to take place in February. The council will introduce green light traffic filters in the city. They will ban private vehicles from 6 areas at certain times and are set to be introduced next year. Well, Ben Pyle is an independent researcher and writer, and exactly the kind of person we need in this country at the moment. Good morning, Ben. Are you there? I believe that you are one of the people... Good morning. You're one of the people helping to galvanise public opposition to this plan. Why?
Yeah, well, Together Declaration has many thousands of members and signatories and people with expertise. And we believe that the scheme in Oxford and elsewhere in the country simply isn't democratic, hasn't passed any democratic tests, and people aren't being listened to. If you look at the consultations and the consultation process, it seems that Oxfordshire County Council and Oxford County Council are quite intransigent in their approach to the public, and this is a problem that stems from all parties that are involved in those governments. So recently, the Conservatives lost overall control, but they were quite keen on this kind of traffic management system, and now there is a coalition of Liberal Democrats, Labour and Greens, and they're all identical, it seems to us. So there hasn't been a debate at the political level in Oxfordshire or Oxford, which reflects what's happening at the national level.
But
I would say with the net zero agenda. Sorry.
No, sorry, Ben. I was just going to say, isn't it the case, though, when it comes to net zero, there doesn't need to be any sort of democratic process? It just feels like this decision has been just made for us, and we all have to buy into it, even if that means small yet huge changes to our life and the decisions and the choices that we're allowed to make about where we move around. Why... Help us to understand this in terms of, even if you believe that we should be saving the planet, that doesn't seem like a crazy idea to buy into, but why does it concern you and the Together Declaration that these changes are in the pipeline? What are we at risk of losing?
Well, I think democracy is the best way of determining policy, and that means a frank conversation about the problems either a town like Oxford or the whole country face. So it might be that the people of Oxford ultimately want more draconian management of traffic, and it might be that the country as a whole wants. Well, frankly, wants expensive energy, and or at least is willing to pay the costs for what it believes is important, the emissions reduction. But actually, it turns out that climate policies might be worse than climate change itself. If you're gonna lose your income, you may lose your house, and you may join many thousands of other people in losing your income or your house. Then that it's hard to say that that's a problem that's preferable to slightly different weather. And we need to have a debate about the science, whether that's really happening as well. But to bring it back to Oxford, I think it would be very simple to have that conversation, but it requires that the political parties listen to their constituents, and it means they can't form consensuses between themselves about what they're going to do to us. It means that they must remember that they are public servants. And that's the principle that Together Declaration, which is organising a lot of events in Oxford next year, hopes to reassert.
Now, Ben, the council say that traffic filters have been part of Oxford's transport strategy since 2015. They are just a tool to reduce traffic congestion in Oxfordshire. They say that the traffic filters are not designed to stop people from driving private vehicles. Do you agree with that assessment of this potential policy?
I think that Oxford's a complex place. Well, it's not complex. It's a small city, and there are it meets in the middle at a crossroads of 4, right? So there's a lot of potential for people. Most people probably do walk or cycle to get around, right? So that requires some management. Where if everyone wants to go through the city, it's always faced problems of congestion. And its politicians have always sort of been very keen on reducing people's usage of cars across the city and around the city. But again, I return to the point: there has to be a conversation, right, and with the public about how that goes ahead. Because what's happened? It's almost as if quite a cabal has developed within local governments of all kinds, not just in Oxford, which has been allowed to make decisions on the public's behalf without that being tested, right? So, and I mean, if you look at the number of people who vote in local elections, it's actually very small. It certainly doesn't exceed 45, 40, or 50%, right? And in some places it's as low as 12% within the county and within the city. So if there's a winning party or even a winning coalition, it's only got the support of a fraction of the number of people that would sort of not typically qualify as a majority, right? So Oxford it has been quite a green place. It's produced MEPs like Caroline Lucas and writers like George Monbiot, and so there is quite a green core to the city. But I would say people have been pushed out of politics at the local and national level, and that's allowed this green ideology to fester within local civil service and local government, and so now we're facing this situation where there is an antagonism, a growing antagonism, which has maybe reached something of a tipping point between the public and the local authority, and that's Ben, not for the good. That's not
just last word then. Can you tell us when the protest is planned for, and if people wanted to join you, what do they need to do? Where can they find out information?
So I don't know. Together organise it. Sorry, I don't know if Together Declaration is organising a protest. We're organising events. So I think it's probably for the people of Oxford to organise protests. We're going to be holding debates and talks and so on and so forth in Oxford and in other places because we're a national organisation, so people can find out what's going to be happening by looking on the Together Declaration website or the Twitter feed.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Ben Pyle there. I'm going to ask you, Lord Moylan, because you kind of know quite a lot about this, don't you? How is it going to work, and what's the logic behind it? Because I think you can apply, if you're a resident, you can apply for a permit so you can use your car in these zones for more than 100 days a year, which is what your limit, I think, will be.
I like Ben. I'm interested in where these policies come from, and I chair the Select Committee in the House of Lords that includes transport in its remit. So I have actually spent some time looking at this, and it's actually up and down the country. Towns and cities up and down the country are setting themselves targets to reduce private vehicular traffic mileage by between 25 and 30%. So where's that number come from? So I asked the Minister, is this coming from the government? Nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the government. These are all local decisions. So you dig further into it, and what you actually find is that there are academic studies showing that if you're going to hit the government's interim net zero target for 2030, you're going to have to reduce private vehicular traffic by between 25 and 30%. Right. And these academic studies, or the one or two that have been done, get picked up by the professional organisations that represent highways engineers, and they get into the policy-making apparatus by that route, and suddenly councillors are being told this is what you've got to do to meet net zero targets, and some of them are very open to that because they're very pro-net zero, not all, but many of them are. And all of a sudden you find you've got these really very draconian policies, because to make that reduction, even if people are switching to because I say to them, but if people switch to electric vehicles, you wouldn't have a net zero effect, you wouldn't need to do this, you see. And they are switching, many of them, to electric vehicles. And they say, oh, yeah, but, the tyres have, the tyres make a noise and so on. So it's an ideology which is driven by the fact that the net zero target is in law for 2050. To change that, you have to change the law. But the government has set interim targets for 2030 and 2035, and they don't make sense in the context of the switch to electric vehicles.
They also don't make sense in terms of keeping
and they're cruel to people.
Yes.
That's what they're cruel to people.
That's right. And for our town centres, where we frankly should just have free parking and encourage people to drive so we can keep shops open. Stephen, I was listening to that and thinking about how Keir Starmer was making his statement last week in Leeds when he was saying he wants to devolve more powers to local councils. Well, as we can see in Oxford, when they've got more powers, they make a mess of it. Surely. There's this terrible, damning indictment today that Labour are on track for a 314-seat majority at the next general election. Good news for you, terrible news for you.
I'll take that with a shovelful of salt, but I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute. But look, the thing is, there is local democracy, and in Ealing, we brought in all these local traffic, you had LTNs, okay, and we then, consulted on it. We agreed that in some cases people actually wanted to keep them, and they have in South Hanwell, up in Lady Margaret, they've actually kept them. Other places they didn't. And last May, Labour won every single seat along that Uxbridge Road. In fact, the Tories are now the third party in Ealing. So you can consult. But I think what Ben Pyle said, something that I think is very, very dangerous, what he said.
Can I just draw your attention to this graphic, Stephen? So these are the red seats that Labour are likely to win in the next election.
But hang on a second, that's Richie Sunak's seat up there.
Yes, according to this particular poll, this is by Savanta and Electoral Calculus, Labour will have a 20-point voting intention lead, which, when converted to seats, would more than double the number of MPs it currently has in Westminster, and taking Rishi Sunak.
It looks like Liz Truss is OK, though, so it's not all good news, is it?
But go on, you were going to make it. You said something Ben said that you didn't agree.
No, I think what he said was actually very dangerous. What he said is sometimes that mitigation can actually be worse than climate change, and he said that I think he used the expression for different weather, and he said about people could lose their jobs, lose their homes, lose their livelihood. I think if you lose your job and you lose your home, you can get another job and you can get another home. If the weather changes irrevocably, which is entirely possible, we can argue the toss about this, but I mean all the evidence around me seems to suggest that we're in a different era of weather now. Then that's irrevocable. You can't turn it back.
But are we not being arrogant to suggest that we can change it?
There are no natural cycles.
Of course they're natural. The Thames froze over in the 17th century, but that was,
of course the weather changes.
300 years ago.
Only 300 years ago. And of course the weather changes through a natural cycle, whether you've got man-made climate change. I'm not denying there might be man-made climate change, but there is going to be change, and we will have to adapt. Even if you got rid of all the carbon in the atmosphere and you went back to where you were, there was still change in the weather. The Thames froze over. That wasn't because of man-made climate change. That was pre-industrial. OK, so what do? You adapt. You see, what I've always thought is that if I lived on a beach and I thought the sea was going to rise, I could do a couple of things. I could move inland. I could put the house on stilts. I could build a seawall. OK, what I wouldn't do is go down to the beach and say to the sea, "Oh, sea, if I give up the motor and stop the cows farting, will you leave me alone?"
Well, don't forget, a lot of
and that's the approach we're taking, when we should be taking the approach, like the Dutch. The Dutch have shown us you can build land out into the sea and make new land, and it's permanent new land.
Danny, what we're saying is
we've got to force massive changes on people with no explanation. All we do is we wave this climate alarmism at them and say, "You're all going to die." And no explanation, and it's good for you, and they're not accepting it. And I think it's good that they're challenging.
No, listen, you talk about the natural cycle. One of the reasons a lot of the people are coming to this country from Mauritania, from Gabon, from West Africa, is because of desertification, because they can no longer have a lifestyle. They can no longer... do you remember the Janjaweed in Sudan who were, slaughtering the people? That was all to do with farming rights and, where you can actually have your cattle fed. So this climate change is real. I don't think anyone can deny that. Well, and it's actually driving immigration. So these two stories come together.
Isn't it fair to say some of those displaced people are also victims of corrupt governments, of war,
no argument.
behaviour, not necessarily just more rain?
Africa is a fascinating and wonderful place. There's huge urbanisation in Africa. Increasing numbers of the population are not dependent on moving there. You see the David Attenborough type films of Africa, and it's all sort of natural and tribal movements and everything. That's a very, very small part of African life now. The people who are coming here are not being... I'm not saying there isn't desertification, it's been going on for decades, but they're not coming here because of an argument about a few sheep and where they might graze. They're very often coming here from urban centres with a degree of education, and they see themselves as an opportunity. They see an opportunity to make a life here, and they've got a travel agent at the end of the road who's saying, "Give me $3,000 and we'll sort it for you. We've got a pilot lined up." That's the sort of thing that's actually going on. And it is true that there's some countries, people in Africa suffer when there are wars and violent movements like that. Left to themselves in peace, actually people get on fine and they have a life. And they've been moving over the decades from a rural life into an urban life. And we mustn't think of it all like it's all David Attenborough where you're fighting with the elephants the whole time.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I just want to bring in some of your views as well.